Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization. Volume 7. The Age of Reason Begins. To our beloved daughter, Ethel. To the reader. I had hoped to conclude my sketch of the history of civilization with a 7th volume to be called The Age of Reason, which was to cover the cultural development of Europe from the accession of Elizabeth I to the outbreak of the French Revolution. But as the story came closer to our times and interest, it presented an ever greater number of personalities and events still vitally influential today, and these demanded no mere lifeless chronicle, but a humanizing visualization, which in turn demanded space. Hence these realms What had begun as a final volume has swollen into 3 and 1 of the present authors at an unseemly age, becomes a prima donna and making a succession of farewell tours. 2 of these 3 volumes have been completed in their first draft. One has been rewritten, and it here ventures into print. It proposes to cover the history of economic life, statesmanship, religion, morals, manners, music, art, literature, science, and philosophy in all the countries of Europe, and in the Islam of Turkey and Persia, from the accession of Elizabeth I, 1558, and the births of Bacon, 1561, and Shakespeare, 1564, to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, and the deaths of Galileo, 1642, and Descartes, 1650. In this period, the basic developments were the rise of murderous nationalisms and the decline of murderous theologies. Barring some lethal surprise to the authors or to civilization, Volume 8, The Age of Louis XIV, should be ready in 1963, and if decay permits, a final volume, The Age of Voltaire, will appear in 1965. The unifying theme of all 3 volumes will be the growth of reason. There is no attempt in these volumes or their predecessors to rely predominantly upon contemporary sources and documents for political or economic or military history. To do this for all the nations of Asia and Europe through all their generations and all their activities would have been physically impossible in one lifetime. But in cultural history, which is the primary concern of this record, there has been an almost complete resort to the original sources. Every major religion has been studied in its main habitat. Every major work of literature has been read or reread. Every major work of art has been visited. Every important contribution to philosophy has been explored. Since the great debate between religion and science is the main current in the stream of modern thought, it will be recorded in these pages more frankly than may seem wise to men of the world. These have long since concluded that religious beliefs fill too vital a function in sustaining individual morality and morale, and social order and control, to justify their disturbance by public discussion. Much can be said for this point of view, and we shall find some of our dramatis personae expressing it. But obviously it cannot release the historian from his obligation to find and describe the fundamental processes in the cultural history of modern Europe. It can, however, obligate him to impartiality in selecting and presenting the facts and personalities according to their influence in shaping events and results. We shall hear Pascal and Bossuet, as well as Spinoza and Voltaire. Grateful acknowledgment is due to our daughter Ethel, who typed with patient care and skill the hardly legible second draft and corrected some of my errors. To Dr. C. Edward Hopkin, and to Flora, Sarah, Mary, and Harry Kaufman for help in classifying the material. Mrs. Durant's part in these concluding volumes has been so substantial that our names must be united on the title page. Will Durant, Los Angeles, May 1961. Notes on the use of this book. 1. Dates of birth and death are usually omitted from the narrative, but will be found in the index. 2. Monetary equivalents, as between past and present, are guesswork, made doubly hazardous by periodic inflation. We note that an able seaman's pay per day in the England of 1540 was 6 pence, and in 1880 6 shillings, a 12-fold increase. Froude, the reign of Elizabeth V, 385, in brackets. Hume calculated that prices had risen threefold in England between 1492 and 1740. In brackets, Essays 175. We have conservatively reckoned prices to have risen another threefold between 1740 and 1960, and therefore 9 times since 1492. We may in general assume that coins had in 17th century Europe approximately 10 times their present purchasing power. The reader may use the following rough equivalents as between 1600 and 1960 in terms of the currency of the United States of America. Crown, $12.50. Ducat, $12.50. AQ, $8. Florin, $12.50. Franc, $2.50. Guilder, $10.50. Guinea, $52.50. Gulden, $10.50. Livre, $12.50. Louis gold, $50. Maravetti, 15 cents. Mark, $33.33. Penny, 20 cents. Pound, $50. Real, $50. Ruble, real, 50 cents. Ruble, $10. Scudo, $1.16. Shilling, $2.50. Thaler, $10. The location of works of art, when not indicated in the text, will usually be found in the notes. In allocating such works, the name of the city will imply its leading gallery, as follows. Amsterdam, Rijksmuseum. Berlin, Staatsmuseum. Bologna, Accademia di Belle Arti. Brussels Museum. Budapest, Museum of Fine Arts. Cassel Museum. Chantilly, Musée Condé. Chatsworth, Duke of Devonshire Collection. Chicago, Art Institute. Cincinnati, Art Institute. Cleveland, Museum of Art. Detroit, Institute of Art. Dresden, Gemäldé Gallery. Dulwich, College Gallery. Edinburgh, National Gallery. Ferrara, Galleria Estense. Frankfurt, Stedelsches Kunstinstitut. Geneva, Musée d'Art et d'Histoire. Haarlem, Frans Hals Museum. The Hague, Mauritius. Kansas City, Nelson Gallery. Leningrad, Hermitage. Lisbon, National Museum. London, National Gallery. Madrid, Prado. Milan, Barrera. Minneapolis, Institute of Arts. Munich, Haus der Kunst. Naples, Museo Nacional. New York, Metropolitan Museum of Art. Nuremberg, Germanisches National Museum. Philadelphia, Johnson Collection. Rouen, Musée Municipal. St. Louis, Art Museum. San Diego, Fine Arts Gallery. San Francisco, De Young Museum. Sarasota, Florida, Ringling Museum of Art. Seville, Art Museum. Stockholm, National Museum. Vienna, Konsthortisches Museum. Washington, National Gallery. 4. Passages in reduced type are especially dull and recondite, and are not essential to the general picture of the age. Book 1. The English Ecstasy, 1558 to 1648. Chapter 1. The Great Queen, 1558 to 1603. 1. The Uses of Adversity. The Uses of Adversity. On November 17, 1558, a courier galloped into the court of the royal palace at Hatfield, 36 miles north of London, and announced to Elizabeth Tudor that she was Queen of England. Her half-sister, Queen Mary, of pitiful fame, had died in the dark of that morning. In London, the Parliament, receiving the news, cried out, "God save Queen Elizabeth! Long may she reign over us," not dreaming that it would be 45 years. The churches, though foreboding trouble, thrilled the air with the clangor of their bells. The people of England, as they had done for Mary, spread festive tables in the streets, and that evening they colored the sky with bonfires of eternal hope. By Saturday, the 19th, the leading lords, ladies, and commoners of the realm had gathered at Hatfield to vow their allegiance and feather their nest. To them, on the 20th, Elizabeth spoke right royally. Here's the quote. "My lords, the laws of nature move me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that has fallen upon me maketh me amazed, and yet, considering I am God's creature ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace, to be the minister of his heavenly will in the office now committed to me. And as I am but one body materially considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all, my lords, chiefly you of the nobility, every one in his degree and power, to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling, and you with your service, may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth. End of the quote. On the 28th, clad in purple velvet, Elizabeth rode through London in public procession to that same tower where 4 years earlier she had been a prisoner awaiting death. Now on her route, the populace acclaimed her, choruses chanted her glory, children tremblingly recited to her the little speeches of homage they had memorized, and such shooting of guns as never was heard afore heralded a reign destined to abound beyond any English precedent in splendor of men and minds. 25 years of trials had tempered Elizabeth to mastery. It seemed in 1533 good fortune to have been fathered by Henry VIII, but it was dangerous to have been born of Anne Boleyn. The disgrace and execution of the mother fell within the child's forgetful years, 1536. Yet the pain of that sombre heritage outlived her youth, and yielded only to the balm of sovereignty. An Act of Parliament, 1536, declared Anne's marriage null, making Elizabeth illegitimate. Coarse gossip debated the girl's paternity. In any case, to most Englishmen, she was the daughter of adultery. Her legitimacy was never re-established in law, but another Act of Parliament, 1544, confirmed her right, after her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary, to succeed to the throne. During Edward's rule, 1547 to 53, she adhered to the Protestant worship, but when Catholic Mary acceded, Elizabeth, preferring life to consistency, conformed to the Roman ritual. After Wyatt's rebellion, 1554, had failed to unseat Mary, Elizabeth was accused of complicity and was sent to the Tower, but Mary judged her guilt unproved, and released her to live under surveillance at Woodstock. Before Mary died, she recognized her sister as her successor, and sent her the jewels of the crown. We owe Elizabeth's reign to the kindliness of the Bloody Queen. Elizabeth's more formal education was overwhelming. Her famous tutor, Roger Ascham, boasted that she talks French and Italian as well as she does English, and has often talked to me readily and well in Latin, moderately in Greek. She had a daily stint of theology and became expert in Protestant dogma, and her Italian teachers seem to have transmitted to her something of the skepticism they had imbibed from Pomponsanazi, Machiavelli, and Renaissance Rome. She was never sure of her crown. Parliament, 1553, had reaffirmed the invalidity of her mother's marriage to her father. State and Church agreed that she was a bastard, and English law, ignoring William the Conqueror, excluded bastards from the throne. The whole Catholic world, and England was still largely Catholic, believed that the legal heir to the English sceptre was Mary Stuart, great-granddaughter of Henry VII. It was intimated to Elizabeth that if she made her peace with the Church, the Pope would wash her free of bastardy and recognize her right to rule. She was not so inclined. Thousands of Englishmen held property that had been expropriated from the Church by Parliament under Henry VIII and Edward VI. These influential possessors fearing that a continued Catholic restoration might enforce restitution, were prepared to fight for a Protestant queen, and the Catholics of England preferred her to civil war. On January 15th, 1559, amid the acclamation of Protestant London, Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey as Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, for English monarchs since Edward III had regularly claimed the throne of France. Nothing had been left undone to provide the Queen with problems. She was now 25, in all the charm of maturing womanhood. She was moderately tall, with a good figure, fair features, olive complexion, flashing eyes, auburn hair, and beautiful hands which she knew how to display. It seemed impossible that such a lass should cope successfully with the chaos that encompassed her. Hostile creeds divided the land, playing for power and wielding arms. Pauperism was endemic, and vagrancy had survived the terrible penalties laid upon it by Henry VIII. Domestic trade was clogged by a dishonest currency. Half a century of false coinage had left the credit of the fisc so low that the government had to pay 14% for loans. Mary Tudor, absorbed in religion, had skimped on natural defense. The fortresses were neglected, the coast unprotected, the navy unfit, the army ill-paid and ill-fed, and its cadres unfilled. England, which, under Wolsey, had held the balance of power in Europe, was now a political cripple bandied about between Spain and France. French troops were in Scotland, and Ireland was inviting Spain. The Pope was holding over the Queen's head the threat of excommunication and indirect of invasion by the Catholic states. Invasion definitely loomed in 1559, and fear of assassination was part of Elizabeth's life from day to day. She was saved by the disunion of her enemies, the wisdom of her counselors, and the courage of her soul. The Spanish ambassador was shocked by the spirit of the woman. She is possessed of the devil, who is dragging her to his place. Europe had not expected to find the spirit of an emperor behind the smiles of a girl. Elizabethan government. Her penetration proved itself at once in her choice of aids. Like her embattled father, and despite her politic speech at Hatfield, she chose men of untitled birth. For most of the older nobles were Catholic, and some thought themselves fitter than she to wear the crown. As her secretary and principal adviser, she named William Cecil, whose genius for prudent policy and assiduous detail became so outstanding a factor in her success that those who did not know her thought him king. His grandfather was a prosperous yeoman, become country gentleman. His father was yeoman of the wardrobe to Henry VIII. His mother's dowry raised the family to a comfortable estate. William left Cambridge without a degree, took law at Gray's Inn, sowed his wild oats in London's common fields, entered the House of Commons at 23, 1543, and married, as his second wife, Mildred Cooke, whose grim Puritanism helped him toe the Protestant line. He served Protector Somerset, then Somerset's enemy, Northumberland. He supported Lady Jane Grey to succeed Edward VI, but switched to Mary Tudor in the nick of time. He became a conforming Catholic at her suggestion, and was appointed by her to welcome Cardinal Pole into England. He was a man of affairs who did not allow his theological somersaults to disturb his political equilibrium. When Elizabeth made him her secretary, she addressed him with her usual sagacity. The quote, "I give you this charge that you shall be of my privy council, and content to take pains for me and my realm. This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted by any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state, and that without respect of my private will, you will give me that counsel which you think best. And if you shall know anything necessary to be declared to me of secrecy, you shall show it to myself only, and assure yourself I will not fail to keep taciturnity therein. And therefore, herewith I charge you." End of the quote. The test of his fidelity and competence is that she kept him as secretary for 14 years, then as Lord Treasurer for 26 more, till his death. He presided over the council, managed foreign relations, directed public finance and national defense, and guided Elizabeth in the definite establishment of Protestantism in England. Like Richelieu, he thought the safety and stability of his country required the unifying absolutism. Like Richelieu, he thought the safety and stability of his country required the unifying absolutism of the monarch, as against the divisive ambitions of contentious nobles, covetous merchants, and fratricidal faiths. He had some Machiavellian ways, rarely cruel but relentless against opposition. Once he thought of having the Earl of Westmoreland assassinated, but that was an impatient moment in a half-century of patient tenacity and personal rectitude. He had eyes and spies for everything, but eternal vigilance is the price of power. He was acquisitive and thrifty, but Elizabeth pardoned his wealth for his wisdom and loved the parsimony that accumulated the means for defeating the Armada. Without him, she might have been misled by such later lights and spendthrift peacocks as Leicester, Hatton, and Essex. Cecil reported the Spanish ambassador has more genius than the rest of the council put together, and is therefore envied and hated on all sides. Elizabeth sometimes listened to his enemies, and now and then treated him so harshly that he left her presence broken in tears. But she knew, when out of her tantrums, that he was the steadiest pillar of her reign. In 1571, she made him Lord Burleigh, head of the new aristocracy that, in the face of hostile nobles, upheld her throne and made her kingdom great. Her minor aides deserve a line even in hurried history, for they served her with competence, courage, and scant remuneration, to the exhaustion of their lives. Sir Nicholas Bacon, father of Francis, was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal from the outset of the reign till his death, 1579. Sir Francis Knollys was a Privy Councillor from 1558 and Treasurer of the royal household till his end, 1596. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton was her skilful ambassador in France, and Thomas Randolph in Scotland, Russia, and Germany. Only next to Cecil in devotion and craft was Sir Francis Walsingham, a Secretary of State from 1573 to his death, 1590, a man of sensitive refinement, whom Spenser called the great Maecenas of his age, so shocked by repeated plots against the Queen's life that he formed for her protection a web of espionage that stretched from Edinburgh to Constantinople, and caught in its skein the tragic Queen of Scots. Seldom has a ruler had servitors so able, so loyal, and so poorly paid. For the English government itself was poor. Private fortunes outshone public funds. The revenue in 1600 totaled £500,000, which even now would be a paltry 25 million. Elizabeth seldom levied direct taxes, and she took in only £36,000 in custom dues. Ordinarily, she relied on income from crown lands, on grants in aid from the English Church, and on loans from the rich, which practically compulsory but punctually repaid. She honored the debts left by her father, her brother, and her sister, and acquired such reputation for solvency that she could borrow money at Antwerp at 5%, while Philip II of Spain at times could not borrow at all. She was extravagant, however, in her expenditure for dresses and finery, and in gifts of economic privileges to her favorites. Rarely and reluctantly, she summoned Parliament to her financial aid, for she did not patiently bear opposition, criticism, or surveillance. She put no stock in theories of popular or parliamentary sovereignty. She believed with Homer and Shakespeare that only one head should rule. And why not hers, in which ran the blood and burned the pride of Henry VIII? She held to the divine right of kings and queens. She imprisoned persons at her own sharp will, without trial or stated cause, and the Privy Council acted as the court of Star Chamber to try political offenders, suspended without appeal and rights of habeas corpus and jury trial. She punished MPs who obstructed her purposes. She suggested to the local magnates who manipulated elections to Parliament that it would facilitate matters if they chose candidates with no boyish notions about free speech. She wanted pounds without palaver. Her early parliaments yielded gracefully. Her middle parliaments yielded angrily. Her later parliaments neared revolt. She got her will because the nation preferred her judicious absolutism to the fury of factions competing for power. No one thought of letting the people rule. Politics was, as always, a contest of minorities to determine which should rule the majority. Half of England resented Elizabeth's religious policy. Nearly all England resented her celibacy. But by and large, the people, grateful for low taxes, flourishing trade, domestic order, and prolonged peace, returned the affection offered them by the Queen. She gave them pageants and progresses listened to them without visible boredom, shared in their public games, and in 100 other ways fished for men's souls. The Spanish ambassador, while bemoaning her Protestantism, wrote to Philip, "She is much attached to the people, and is confident that they are all on her side," which is indeed true. The attempts that were made on her life strengthened her popularity and power. Even the Puritans whom she persecuted prayed for her safety, and the anniversary of her accession became a day of national thanksgiving and festival. Was she the actual ruler, or only a popular front for the lower nobility of England and the mercantile oligarchy of London? Her aides, though fearing her temper, often corrected her mistakes of policy, but she often corrected theirs. They told her disagreeable truths, gave her their contradictory counsels, and obeyed her decisions. They governed, but she ruled. "She gives her orders," reported the Spanish ambassador, "and has her way as absolutely as her father." Cecil himself seldom knew how she would decide, and he fretted over her frequent rejection of his laborious and meticulous advice. When he urged her not to treat with France, but to rely solely on Protestant support, she pulled him up with some asperity. "Mr. Secretary, I mean to have done with this business. I shall listen to the proposals of the French king. I am not going to be tied any longer to you and your brethren in Christ." Her statesmanship drove both friends and enemies to tears. She was maddeningly slow and irresolute in determining policy, but in many cases her indecision paid. She knew how to ally herself with time, which dissolves more problems than men solve. Her procrastination allowed the complex factors in a situation to settle themselves into focus and clarity. She admired the fabled philosopher who, when importuned for an answer, silently recited the alphabet before replying. She took as her motto, "Video et taceo," I see and am silent. She discovered that in politics, as in love, he who does not hesitate is lost. If her policy often fluctuated, so did the facts and forces to be weighed. Surrounded by perils and intrigues, she felt her way with forgivable caution, trying now one course, now another, and making no claim to consistency in so fluid a world. Her vacillation stumbled into some serious errors, but it kept England at peace until it was strong enough for war, inheriting a nation politically in chaos and militarily in decay. Her only practicable policy was to keep England's enemies from uniting against it, to encourage the Huguenot revolt against the French monarchy, the Netherlands revolt against Spain, the Protestant revolt against the Scottish Queen, too closely bound to France. It was an unscrupulous policy, but Elizabeth believed with Machiavelli that scruples are not becoming in rulers responsible for states. By whatever means her subtle weakness could devise, she preserved her country from foreign domination, maintained peace, with some brief intervals, for 30 years, and left England richer than ever before in matter and mind. As a diplomat, she could give the foreign secretaries of the age many a lesson in alert information, resourceful expedients, and incalculable moves. She was the ablest liar of our time. Of the 4 women, Mary Tudor, Mary Stuart, Catherine de Medicis, and Elizabeth, who illustrated Knox's monstrous regiment, rule in brackets, of women in the second half of the 16th century. Elizabeth was unquestionably supreme in political acumen and diplomatic skill. Cecil thought her the wisest woman that ever was, for she understood the interest and dispositions of all the princes in her time, and was so perfect in the knowledge of her own realm that no counselor she had could tell her anything she did not know before, which of course requires a grain of salt. She had the advantage of conferring directly with ambassadors in French, Italian, or Latin, and was thereby independent of interpreters and intermediaries. "This woman," said the Spanish ambassador, "is possessed with 100,000 devils, yet she pretends to me that she would like to be a nun, live in a cell, and tell her beads from morning till night." Every continental government condemned and admired her. "If she were not a heretic," said Pope Sixtus V, "she would be worth a whole world." (3) The amorous virgin. The secret weapon of her diplomacy was her virginity. This condition, of course, is a recondite detail on which historians must not pretend to certainty. Let us be as truthful as Raleigh, naming a colony. Cecil, watching Elizabeth's long flirtation with Leicester, had some passing doubts, but two Spanish ambassadors, not loath to dishonor the Queen, concluded to her honor. The gossip of the court, as reported by Ben Jonson to Drummond of Hawthornden, held that she had a membrane on her which made her incapable of man, though for her delight she tried many. A French surgeon undertook to cut it, yet fear stayed her. The People, wrote Camden in his Annals, 1615, cursed Hewick, the Queen's physician, as having dissuaded the King from marrying on account of some impediment and defect in her. Yet Parliament, repeatedly begging her to marry, assumed her capacity to bear. Something went wrong in this regard with most of Tudor royalty. Probably the misfortunes of Catherine of Aragon in childbirth were due to Henry VIII's syphilis. His son Edward died in youth of some ill-described disease. His daughter Mary tried fervently to have a child, only to mistake dropsy for pregnancy, and Elizabeth, though she flirted as long as she could walk, never ventured on marriage. "I have always shrunk from it," she said, and as early as 1559 she declared her intention to remain a virgin. In 1566 she promised Parliament, "I will marry as soon as I can conveniently, and I hope to have children." But in that same year, when Cecil told her that Mary Stuart had borne a son, Elizabeth almost wept and said, "The Queen of Scots is the mother of a fair son, and I am but a barren stock." There for a moment she revealed her lasting grief, that she could not fulfill her womanhood. The political implications deepened the tragedy. Many of her Catholic subjects believed her sterility a proper punishment for her father's sins, and a promise that Catholic Mary Stuart would inherit the crown. But Parliament and the rest of Protestant England dreaded such a prospect, and importuned her to find a mate. She tried, but began by losing her heart to a married man, Lord Robert Dudley. Tall, handsome, accomplished, courtly, brave, was the son of that Duke of Northumberland, who had died on the scaffold for trying to disinherit Mary Tudor and make Jane Grey queen. Dudley was married to Amy Robsart, but was not living with her, and rumour called him an unprincipled philanderer. He was with Elizabeth at Windsor, when his wife fell downstairs at Cumnor Hall, and died of a broken neck. 1560. He and the Queen were suspected by the Spanish ambassador and others of having arranged this clumsy annulment. The suspicion was unjust, but it ended for a while Dudley's hopes of becoming consort to Elizabeth. When she thought she was dying, 1562, she begged that he might be appointed protector of the realm. She confessed that she had long loved him, but called God to witness that nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. 2 years later, she offered him to the Queen of Scots and made him Earl of Leicester to enhance his charms, but Mary was loath to have her rival's lover in her bed. Elizabeth comforted him with monopolies and favoured him till his death, 1588. Cecil had borne this romance with dignified hostility. For a time he thought of resigning in protest, for his own plan contemplated a marriage that would strengthen England with the friendship of some powerful state. For a quarter of a century a succession of foreign suitors danced about the Queen. "There are 12 ambassadors of us," wrote one of them, "all competing for Her Majesty's hand, and the Duke of Holstein is coming next, as a suitor for the King of Denmark. The Duke of Finland, who is here for his brother the King of Sweden, threatens to kill the Emperor's man, and the Queen fears they will cut each other's throat in her presence." She must have felt some satisfaction when Philip II, the greatest potentate in Christendom, offered her his seasoned hand, 1559. But she rejected this device for making England a Catholic dependency of Spain. She took more time in answering a proposal from Charles IX of France was meanwhile kept on good behavior. The French ambassador complained that the world had been made in 6 days, and she had already spent 80 days, and was still undecided. She artfully replied that the world had been made by a greater artist than herself. 2 years later, she allowed English agents to propose her marriage to Charles, Archduke of Austria, but at Leicester's urging, she withdrew the plan. When the international situation favored humoring France, 1570, the Duke of Alençon, son of Henry II and Catherine de Medicis, was encouraged to think of becoming the 16-year-old husband of the 37-year-old Queen. But the negotiations were wrecked on 3 obstacles: the Duke's Catholic faith, his tender youth, and his pockmarked nose. 5 years softened one of these deterrents, and Alençon, now Duke of Anjou, was considered again. He was invited to London, and for 5 years more Elizabeth played with him and France. After a final flurry, 1581, this gay courtship petered out, and Anjou retired from the field, waving as a trophy a garter of the Queen. Meanwhile, she had kept him from marrying the Infanta, and thereby allying her 2 enemies, France and Spain. Rarely has a woman derived so much advantage from barrenness, or so much pleasure from virginity. 4. Elizabeth and her court. There was more satisfaction in being courted by virile Elizabethans than in being bedded by epoxy youth, and the courtship could last as long as marriage did not stifle it. Hence Elizabeth enjoyed perennial adulation and savored it insatiably. Lords ruined themselves to entertain her. Masques and pageants allegorized her glory. Poets smothered her with sonnets and dedications. Musicians strummed her praise. A madrigal celebrated her eyes as war-subduing orbs, and her breast as that fair hill where virtue dwells, and sacred skill. Raleigh told her that she walked like Venus, hunted like Diana, rode like Alexander, sang like an angel, and played like Orpheus. She almost believed it. She was as vain as if all the merits of her England were the blessed fruit of her mothering, and to a degree they were. Distrustful of her physical charms, she robed herself in costly dresses, varying them almost every day. At her death she left 2,000. She wore jewelry in her hair, on her arms and wrists and ears and gowns. When a bishop reproved her love of finery, she had him warned not to touch on that subject again, lest he reach heaven aforetime. Her manners could be alarming. She cuffed or fondled courtiers, even foreign emissaries. She tickled the back of Dudley's neck when he knelt to receive his earldom. Footnote. Aubrey tells a naughty story. Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, in making his low obeisance to Queen Elizabeth, happened to let a fart, at which he was so abashed and ashamed that he went to travail 7 years. On his return, the Queen welcomed him home, and said, "My lord, I had forgot the fart." End of footnote. She spat as she list, once upon a costly coat. She was usually amiable and easy of access, but she talked volubly, and she could be an unanswerable shrew. She swore like a pirate, which by proxy she was. By God's death was among her milder oaths. She could be cruel, as in playing cat and mouse with Mary Stuart, or letting Lady Catherine Grey languish and die in the Tower. But she was basically kind and merciful, and she mingled tenderness with her blows. She often lost her temper, but she soon regained control of herself. She roared with laughter when amused, which was often. She loved to dance, and pirouetted till she was 69. She gambled and hunted, and was fond of masques and plays. She kept her spirits up, even when her fortunes were low, and in the face of danger she was all courage and intelligence. She was abstemious in food and drink, but covetous of money and jewelry. With relish she confiscated the property of rich rebels, and she managed to get and to hold the crown of jewels of Scotland, Burgundy, and Portugal, besides a hoard of gems presented by expectant lords. She was not renowned for gratitude or liberality. Sometimes she tried to pay her servants in fair words, but there was a certain patriotism in her parsimony and her pride. When she acceded, there was hardly a nation so poor as to do England reverence. When she died, England controlled the seas and challenged the intellectual hegemony of Italy, or France. What sort of mind did she have? She had all the learning that a queen could carry gracefully. While ruling England, she continued her study of languages, corresponded in French with Mary Stuart, bandied Italian with a Venetian ambassador, and berated a Polish envoy in virile Latin. She translated Sallust and Boethius, and knew enough Greek to read Sophocles and translate a play of Euripides. She claimed to have read as many books as any prince in Christendom, and it was likely. She studied history almost every day. She composed poetry and music and played forgivably on the lute and the virginal. But she had sense enough to laugh at her accomplishments and to distinguish between education and intelligence. When an ambassador complicated her on her languages, she remarked that it was no marvel to teach a woman to talk. It were far harder to teach her to hold her tongue. Her mind was as sharp as her speech, and her wit kept pace with the time. Francis Bacon reported that she was wont to say of her instructions, "Two great officers that they were, like the garments straight at the first putting on, but did by and by wear loose enough." Her letters and speeches were composed in an English all her own, devious, involved, and affected, but rich in quaint turns, fascinating in eloquence and character. She excelled in intelligence rather than intellect. Walsingham pronounced her inapt to embrace any matter of weight, but perhaps he spoke in the bitterness of unrequited devotion. Her skill lay in feminine delicacy and subtlety of perception, not in laborious logic, and sometimes the outcome revealed more wisdom in her feline tentatives than in her reasoning. It was her indefinable spirit that counted, that baffled Europe and enthralled England, that gave spur and color to her country's flowering. She reestablished the Reformation, but she represented the Renaissance, the lust to live this earthly life to the full, to enjoy and embellish it every day. She was no exemplar of virtue, but she was a paragon of vitality. Sir John Hayward, whom she sent to the Tower for giving rebellious notions to the younger Essex, forgave her enough to write of her 9 years after she could reward him. The quote, "Now if ever any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of the people, it was the Queen. If ever she did express the same, it was in coupling mildness with majesty as she did, and in stately stooping to the meanest sort. All her faculties were in motion, and every motion seemed a well-guided action. Her eyes were set upon one, her ears listened to another, her judgment ran upon a third. To a fourth she addressed her speech. Her spirit seemed to be everywhere, and yet so entire in herself, as it seemed to be nowhere else. Some she pitied, some she commended, some she thanked, at others she pleasantly and wittingly jested, contemning no person, neglecting no office, and distributing her smiles, looks, and graces so artfully, that thereupon the people again redoubled the testimonies of their joys." End of the quote. Her court was her character, loving the things she loved, and raising her flair for music, games, plays, and vivid speech to an ecstasy of poems, madrigals, dramas, and masques, and such prose as England has never known again. In her palaces at Whitehall, Windsor, Greenwich, Richmond, and Hampton Court, lords and ladies, knights and ambassadors, entertainers, and servitors moved in an exciting alternation of regal ceremony and gallant gaiety. A special office of the revels prepared amusements that ranged from riddles and backgammon to complex masques and Shakespeare's plays. Ascension Day, Christmas, New Year's, Twelfth Night, Candlemas, and Shrovetide were regularly celebrated, with pastimes, athletic contests, jousts, mummings, plays, and masques. The masque was one of many Italian importations into Elizabethan England. A gaudy mixture of pageantry, poetry, music, allegory, buffoonery, and ballet, put together by playwrights and artists presented at court, or on rich estates with complex machinery and evolutions, and performed by masked ladies and gentlemen, burdened with costly costumes and simple lines. Elizabeth was fond of drama, especially of comedy. Who knows how much of Shakespeare would have reached the stage or posterity if she and Lancaster had not supported the theatre through all the attacks of the Puritans. Not content with her 5 palaces, Elizabeth sailed out almost every summer on the cross-country progresses to see and be seen, to keep an eye on her vassal lords, and to enjoy their reluctant homage. Part of the court followed her, delighted with the change and grumbling at the accommodations and the beer. Towns dressed their gentry in velvet and silk to welcome her with speeches and gifts. Nobles bankrupted themselves to entertain her. Hard-pressed lords prayed that she would not come their way. The Queen rode on horseback, or in an open litter, greeting happily the crowds that gathered along the road. The people were thrilled by the sight of her invincible sovereign, and bewitched to fresh loyalty by her gracious compliments and infectious happiness. The court took on her gaiety, her freedom of manners, her luxury of dress, her love of ceremony, and her ideal of the gentleman. She liked to hear the rustle of finery, and the men around her rivaled the women in molding Oriental stuffs to Italian styles. Pleasure was the usual program, but one had to be ready at any moment for martial exploits beyond the seas. Seductions had to be circumspect, for Elizabeth felt responsible to the parents of her maids of honor for their honor. Hence she banished the Earl of Pembroke from the court for making Mary Fitton pregnant. As at any court, intrigue wove many entangled webs. The women competed unscrupulously for the men for the women, and all for the favor of the Queen, and the prerequisites depended thereon. Those same gentlemen who exalted in poetry the refinements of love and morality, itched in prose for sinecures, took or gave bribes, grasped at monopolies, or shared in piratical spoils, and the avid Queen looked indulgently upon a venality that eked out the inadequate pay of her servitors. Through her grants, or by her permission, Leicester became the richest lord in England. Sir Philip Sidney received vast tracts in America. Raleigh acquired 40,000 acres in Ireland. The second Earl of Essex enjoyed a corner on the importation of sweet wines, and Sir Christopher Hatton rose from the Queen's lapdog to Lord Chancellor. Elizabeth was no more sensitive to industrious brains than to handsome legs, for these pillars of society were not yet shrouded in pantaloons. Despite her faults, she set a pace and a course to elicit the reserve energies of England's worthies. She raised their courage to high enterprise, their minds to brave thinking, their manners to grace and wit, and the fostering of poetry, drama, and art. Around that dazzling court and women gathered nearly all the genius of England's greatest age. (5) Elizabeth and religion. But within the court and through the nation, the bitter battle of the Reformation raged and created a problem that many thought would baffle and destroy the Queen. She was a Protestant. The country was 2/3, perhaps 3/4 Catholic. Most of the magistrates, all of the clergy were Catholic. The Protestants were confined to the southern ports and industrial towns. They were predominant in London, where their number was swelled by refugees from oppression on the continent, but in the northern and western counties, almost entirely agricultural. They were a negligible few. The spirit of the Protestants, however, was immeasurably more ardent than the Catholic. In 1559, John Fox published his Return in Ecclesia Gestarum Commentari, describing with passion these sufferings of Protestants under the preceding reign. The volumes were translated, 1563, as Actes and Monuments, popularly known as the Book of Martyrs. They had an arousing influence on English Protestants for over a century. Protestantism in the 16th century had the feverish energy of a new idea fighting for the future. Catholicism had the strength of traditional beliefs and ways deeply rooted in the past. In a spreading minority, the religious turmoil had generated skepticism, even here and there atheism. The conflict of creeds, their mutual criticism, their bloody intolerance, and the contrast between the professions and the conduct of Christians had made some matter-of-fact doubtful of all theologies. Here Roger Ascham's Schoolmaster, 1563. And the quote: "That Italian that first invented the Italian proverb against our Englishmen Italianati met no more their vanity in living than their lewd opinion in religion. They make more account of Tully's offices, Cicero's De Officiis, than St. Paul's epistles, of a tale of Boccaccio, than a story of the Bible. Then they count as fables the holy mysteries of the Christian religion. They make Christ and his gospel only serves civil policy. Then neither religion, Protestantism, or Catholicism cometh amiss to them. In time they be promoters of both openly, in place again mockers of both privily. For where they dare, in company, where they like, they boldly laugh to scorn both Protestant and Papist. They care for no Scripture. They mock the Pope, they rail on Luther. The heaven they desire is only their personal pleasure and private profit, whereby they plainly declare of whose school they be, that is, epicures in living, and atheoi in doctrine." End of the quote. Cecil complained, 1569, that deriders of religion, Epicureans, and atheists are everywhere. John Strype declared, 1571, that many were wholly departed from the communion of the Church and came no more to hear divine service. John Lyly, 1579, thought, "There never were such sects among the heathens, such misbelief among infidels, as is now among scholars. Theologians and others wrote books against atheism, which, however, could mean belief in God but disbelief in Christ's divinity. In 1579, 1583, and 1589, men were burned for denying the divinity of Christ. Several dramatists, Green, Kidd, Marlowe, were reputed atheists. The Elizabethan drama, which otherwise so widely pictures life, contains remarkably little about the strife of faiths, but makes a great play of pagan mythology. In Shakespeare's Love Labour's Lost, 4:3, line 250, are two obscure lines. The quote, "O paradox, black is the badge of hell, the hue of dungeons and the school of night." End of the quote. Many have interpreted the last phrase as referring to the evening as assemblies of Walter Raleigh, the astronomer Thomas Harriot, the scholar Lawrence Keymis, probably the poets Marlowe and Chapman, and some others in Raleigh's country house at Sherborne for the study of astronomy, geography, chemistry, philosophy, and theology. Harriot, apparently the intellectual leader of the group, had strange thoughts of the Scriptures, reported the antiquary Anthony A. Wood, and always undervalued the old story of the creation. He made a philosophical theology, wherein he cast off the Old Testament. He believed in God, but rejected revelation and the divinity of Christ. Robert Parsons, the Jesuit, wrote in 1592 of Sir Walter Raleigh's School of Atheism, wherein both Moises and our Saviour, the Old and New Testaments, are jested at, and the scholars taught to spell God backwards. Moises being Moses, of course, but spelt here Moyses. Raleigh was accused of having listened to Marlowe's reading of an essay on atheism. In March 1594, a government commission sat at Cernay Abbey, Dorset, to investigate rumors of a set of atheists in the vicinity, which included Raleigh's home. The inquiry led to no action now known to us, but charges of atheism were brought against Raleigh during his trial, 1603. In the preface to his History of the World, he made it a point to enlarge upon his belief in God. Some suspicion of free-thinking clings to Elizabeth herself. "No woman," said John Richard Green, "ever lived who was so totally destitute of the sentiment of religion. Elizabeth, in Froude's judgment, was without distinct emotional conviction. Elizabeth, to whom the Protestant creed was as little true as the Catholic, had a latitudinarian contempt for theological dogmatism." That would be a latitudinarian contempt for theological dogmatism. She called upon God with terrible oaths that horrified her ministers to destroy her if she did not keep her promise to marry Alencon, while in private she jested over his pretensions to her hand. She declared to a Spanish envoy that the difference between the warring Christian creeds was a mere bagatelle, whereupon she concluded that she was an atheist. Nevertheless, she took it for granted, like almost all governments before 1789, that some religion, some supernatural source and sanction of morality was indispensable to social order and the stability of the state. For a time, till she had consolidated her position, she appeared to hesitate, and she played upon the hopes of Catholic potentates that she might be won to their public faith. She liked the Catholic ceremony, the celibacy of the clergy, the drama of the Mass, and she might have made her peace with the Church had not this involved submission to the papacy. She distrusted Catholicism as a foreign power that might lead Englishmen to put loyalty to the Church above allegiance to the Queen. She had been reared in the Protestantism of her father, which was Catholicism minus the papacy, and this is essentially what she decided to reestablish in England. She hoped that the semi-Catholic liturgy of her Anglican Church would mollify the Catholics of the countryside, while the rejection of the papacy would satisfy the Protestants of the towns. Meanwhile, state control of education would form the new generation to this Elizabethan settlement, and the disruptive religious strife would be quieted into peace. She made her hesitations in religion, as in marriage, serve her political purposes. She kept potential enemies bemused and divided until she could face them with an accomplished fact. Many forces urged her to complete the Reformation. Continental reformers wrote to thank her in advance for restoring the new worship, and their letters touched her. Holders of formerly church property prayed for a Protestant settlement. Cecil urged Elizabeth to make herself the leader of all Protestant Europe. London Protestants indicated her sentiments by beheading a statue of St. Thomas and casting it into the street. Her first Parliament, January 23rd to May 8th, 1559, was overwhelmingly Protestant. The funds she asked for were voted without reservation or delay, and to raise them a tax was laid upon all persons, ecclesiastical or secular. A new Act of Uniformity, April 28, 1559, made Cramer's Book of Common Prayer, revised the law of English liturgy, and forbade all other religious ritual. The Mass was abolished. All Englishmen were required to attend the Sunday service of the Anglican Church, or forfeit a shilling for the succor of the poor. A new Act of Supremacy, April 29th, declared Elizabeth to be the supreme governor of England in all matters spiritual or temporal. An oath of supremacy, acknowledging the religious sovereignty of the Queen, was required of all clergymen, lawyers, teachers, university graduates, and magistrates, and all employees of the Church or the Crown. All major ecclesiastical appointments and decisions were to be made by an ecclesiastical court of high commission chosen by the government. Any defense of papal authority over England was to be punished by life imprisonment for the first offense, by death for the second. 1563. By 1590, all English churches were Protestant. Elizabeth pretended that she was not persecuting opinion. Any man, she said, might think and believe as he pleased, provided they obeyed the laws. All she asked was external conformity for the sake of national unity. Cecil assured her that that state could never be in safety where there was toleration of two religions, which did not deter Elizabeth from demanding toleration of French Protestants in Catholic France. She had no objection to peaceful hypocrisy, but freedom of opinion was not to be freedom of speech. Preachers who disagreed with her views on any important subject were silenced or dismissed. The laws against heresy were redefined and enforced. Unitarians and Anabaptists were outlawed. 5 heretics were burned during the reign, which seemed a modest number in its day. In 1563, a convocation of theologians defined the new creed. All were agreed on predestination. God, of his own free will, before the creation of the world, and without regard to individual human merit or demerit, had chosen some of mankind to be elect and saved, leaving all the rest to be reprobate and damned. They accepted Lutheran justification, salvation by faith. That is, the elect were saved not by their good works, but by belief in the grace of God and the redeeming blood of Christ. However, they interpreted the Eucharist in Calvin's sense as a spiritual rather than a physical communion with Christ. By an Act of Parliament, 1566, the 39 Articles embodying the new theology were made obligatory on all the clergy of England, and they still express the official Anglican creed. The new ritual, too, was a compromise. The Mass was abolished, but to the horror of the Puritans, the clergy were instructed to wear white surplices in reading the service, and copes in administering the Eucharist. Communion was to be received kneeling in the 2 forms of bread and wine. The invocation of saints was replaced by annual commemoration of Protestant heroes. Confirmation and ordination were retained as sacred rites, but were not viewed as sacraments instituted by Christ, and confession to a priest was encouraged only in expectation of death. Many of the prayers kept Roman Catholic forms, but took on English dress, and became a noble and formative part of the nation's literature. For 400 years, those prayers and hymns, recited by congregation and priest in the spacious splendor of cathedrals, or the simple dignity of the parish church, have given English families inspiration, consolation, moral discipline, and mental peace.